Good morning and welcome to City Watch, a watchdog program for social, economic, political, and cultural issues here in New York City. I'm Jeff Simmons, and today I have a very special co-host, former Daily News reporter and author, Chelsia Marcius. Good morning.
Good morning, Jeff. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you in studio today on this lovely weather day. So we have a great lineup for you this morning, in addition to Chelsia, who's going to talk a little about what she is up to, as well as about her book, Wild Escape, about that prison escape that took place upstate that fascinated the country back in 2015.
Yes.
We also will have New York State Assembly member Linda Rosenthal to talk about substance use disorder treatment in our prison system. And then rounding out our show today will be Dalvanie Powell, president of the United Probation Officers Association, to talk about the valuable work of probation officers. So, Chelsia, since I got you in studio, I've got a lot of questions for you today.
Sure, let's hear them.
But first, for our listeners, tell me, now you and I met when you were a reporter at DNA Info before you went over to the New York Daily News.
Yeah, and I can't believe it's already been that long, Jeff, right?
Yeah, I feel old.
No, it's not.
So tell our listeners a little about your career first before we get to the book.
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me. My Daily News career started in December of 2012. It was actually the day that Newtown happened. And that was my first day on the job for the paper. And December 14th, 2012, I think it was. And I went to Newtown, reported on the shooting, obviously a horrific tragedy. And I was there for about 10 days or so, and I was brought back to the city by my editors. And shortly after that, I was hired as a full-time staff reporter. And that story was something that's obviously near and dear to my heart because it was my first one. It was it really impacted my career a great deal, but it also set the tone for what I would be doing for the Daily News going forward. And a lot of that was, I covered the Boston bombing, I covered the Pulse shooting in Orlando, I covered the shooting in Las Vegas about a year ago. And it was those sorts of tragedies that really defined my career there. But while I was there, I also covered this prison break in Dannemora, and that was June 2015. And I was up in Dannemora a few days after David Sweat and Richard Matt first broke out of the Clinton Correctional Facility. And at the time, I didn't go up right away because we didn't think it was going to be as big of a deal as it ended up being. The first 24 hours or so, we're thinking, okay, my editors are like, yeah.
They'll be found.
Right, they'll be found. A lot of these prison escapes, people escape, and within that first day or so, they do return them and they find them, and things kind of go back to normal. Well, this was pretty much anything but normal. And so the Daily News sent me up there as backup. I was, I think, the second or third reporter there. And I ended up being one of the ones that stayed. And at one point we were brought home because there were really no updates in the escape, and there were other things going on in the news. And then quickly, I think it was like 24 hours later, I was sent right back up to Dannemora from New York City to cover it again because they had some updates in the case.
So what fascinated you most about this story? And, we're going to get to the process of the book, Wild Escape by Diversion Books.
Yeah, Diversion.
We'll get to that. But what fascinated you about this story? Because, I've been up there at the Clinton Correctional Facility when I had done an interview, which I'll bring up a little more detail about in a few moments. But what was it about this that it had all the elements of, an unbelievable story?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's just the atmosphere around Dannemora. And Dannemora, by the way, is the name of the little town where the prison, Clinton Correctional, is located. A lot of times you'll hear them referred to as one and the same, just because they're kind of synonymous with each other. It's almost as if it feels as if one can't exist without the other. And when you go through Dannemora and you approach Dannemora, you go through a lot of wilderness. It's in the Adirondacks. And it's right on the edge of the blue line, which is Adirondack Park, which is 6 million acres of wilderness. It's very dense, thick foliage. And you kind of come out of that foliage and you come down this hill, and depending on which way you're driving in from, and you see this facility that has such a presence there. It is huge, number one. Number two, it's very, very old, and it feels old. It's something that it's just this feeling that kind of descends on you as you're riding past, if you're driving your car, which most people would be doing over there. And so that really struck me when I first went to cover the escape. At that time, there were more cars and more TV trucks and that sort of thing. So it was probably about as lively as it's been in quite some time. But you could still feel the isolation of it. And then as the media started peeling off and peeling away, that isolation was even more present to me. And that was something that was really appealing as well. Like, here is this one place that's in the middle of nowhere, essentially. And I don't mean to insult the people that are from there. It's just more, it's really in the middle of the wilderness. And, being from New York or living in New York for so long, I really wanted to be somewhere kind of like that was very different from what I'm used to in this like kind of concrete jungle.
So, I've known reporters over the years who have covered stories in very, intimate detail and then turned them into a book. And in this case, I'm assuming because you spent so much time up there, you kept good notes. And at what point did you realize I've got a book in me, or how did that happen?
Well, when I first was covering the escape, I had no idea that I'd be doing a book on it. I had no clue. Didn't even think about that at that time. But I did really enjoy covering it. And I did take a lot of notes just because I was interested in it. Like, I'm one of those people that if I take an interesting tour of an architecture tour in Manhattan, I'm taking notes. It's just like a habit for me because I'm interested in the material. So I did the same thing with the escape, even taking photos as I was going along. And I met so many people up there that I really enjoyed talking to. A lot of people that had, upstate New York kind of Canadian accents because they're right at, like, very close to the border of Canada. And there was just a wholesomeness to the people that I interacted with that I really enjoyed as well. So after the escape, after Richard Matt was killed and David Sweat was captured, which we'll get into, I'm sure, shortly.
We will.
Yes, right. After that all happened, everything really wound down, and the story was more or less done from our perspective in the media, and everybody kind of went on to the next story. That experience was still really with me. The people were still really with me. And by the way, I had connected with a lot of people that live up there on social media and stuff. So even though the media was done with it, on social media, these people who later became, friends or sources or people I interviewed, they were still talking about this as if it had just happened, as if it was still happening, because it was such a big deal up there. And it kind of kept my level of excitement about the story up. And it kept coming to the forefront of my mind, like, what's happening with this story? Like, what's happening with David Sweat? Has anybody interviewed him yet? And that was something that never truly left me, even though we were done covering it for the Daily News.
And how long were they out of prison after they escaped? How many days?
Yeah, it was about 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Yeah.
One of the misperceptions that, it's stuck in my mind, but I think, well, you do clarify it in the book, was the love triangle aspect, that there was some sort of love triangle going on. But in the book, you identified that this really was not the case.
Yeah. So the way the story goes is that Richard Matt and David Sweat were in Clinton Correctional for both convicted of murder, and they had both been there for some time, and David was getting a little frustrated with how the system was working, and he had lost his job in the tailor shops where he had worked with prison seamstress Joyce Mitchell. And he felt the way he lost his job there was very unfair, and he was relocated to another job. And Richard Matt, who had also worked in the tailor shops, who had become David's close friend while they were both in Clinton together, kind of proposed the idea of, why don't we try to break out of here? Is something that a lot of inmates talk about, a lot of inmates dream about, I'm sure, but not really anybody, very few people at least actually go out and try to do this. And Richard Matt thought, well, the way we can do this is through Joyce Mitchell, who had already kind of shown them a certain level of, shall we say, affection or
interest.
Interest, exactly. Because I think the affection part probably didn't happen at that point. It came a little later. So David thinks this is a pretty good idea. He goes, you know what? Let's just do it. Why don't we do this? And David's one of those people that he's a planner, and if he says he's going to do something, he's going to execute a plan to make that happen. So Richard Matt was kind of the liaison between Joyce Mitchell and David Sweat, who really didn't have much of a connection after that, because David Sweat's no longer working with her every day as he was before. And so David starts writing Joyce these notes that were really flirtatious in nature, and he passes them on to Richard Matt, who passes them on to Joyce. And meanwhile, Richard Matt's also flirting with Joyce, trying to get her to help them accomplish what they want to accomplish, which was essentially to break out of the prison through the tunnels underneath the facility.
But to be able to do that, they needed tools, and I found it very interesting. Tell our listeners how the tools got in there.
So Joyce ends up going to buy some of the tools that David had requested through these notes that he's passing through Richard Matt, because really David is the one that's planning the whole thing, as I said, and knows how to execute the technicality. All the technicalities were David, where Richard Matt was kind of just the guy that was appealing to her emotional side, Joyce's. So they get her to buy various like hacksaw blades and other things, and she put them in a frozen vat of raw hamburger meat and passed them through security. Now, they didn't have to go through the metal detector, because at Clinton, which was against prison protocol, a lot of people that worked at the facility, like Joyce, just weren't really, it wasn't enforced. These rules weren't enforced, that she had to put various things like raw hamburger meat through a metal detector, which seems strange. I know it seems kind of crazy, but their lunches and that sort of thing, she had been working there a while. People trusted her, and they were lax in what they did.
And in fact, in the book, one of the quotes that I had jotted down is, you write that Matt and Sweat had outsmarted the system. They made a mockery of the state's corrections department, and they had exposed a culture of complacency and corruption that had pervaded Clinton for years. So how so? What were some of the weaknesses that you found in your reporting?
One of the big ones was just that, the lack of security, the lack of checking people. Richard Matt, when he would take the tools that Joyce brought in through the hamburger meat, and he'd get them to David Sweat, he would tape them to his chest. And he was able, in the tailor shop, to tape them to his chest and then go back to the cell block where him and David shared. They for most of their time, they actually had adjoining cells, so they were right next to each other, and they finagled that in one way or another, which is more about that in the book. But they were able to, Richard Matt was then able to pass those tools to David without having ever been checked from when he goes from the prison, the tailor shop, to his cell block. He was never checked through security, because otherwise that would have come up. If he had to go through some sort of metal detector, that would have come up that he had all these tools taped to his chest. So that was just one instance. Another one was a lot of these cell checks that were supposed to be done at night were not done, or they weren't done properly. They weren't done on the hour as they were supposed to be. And David that's when he would work, predominantly was in the night. So he would, literally saw his way out of his cell, which he also did during recreational hours too. So as other inmates are, playing dominoes or whatever they're doing, watching baseball and stuff like that, kind of creating a ruckus, which was a lot of noise that the guards were more focused on, David would kind of just hack away little saw marks in the vent in the back of his cell, and Richard Matt did the same, and be able to remove an air vent that would lead down to these catwalks, where then he could descend into the bowels of Clinton and figure out his way through that labyrinth. That way he could later, at some point down the road, perhaps pop up out of the manhole, which is, if you're familiar with, any structures like this, the manholes are there so that way the steam pressure can release and the prison doesn't, blow up if there's some sort of, problem that would, the air pressure would affect the facility in that way. So that's how he did that.
So after Sweat was captured, how did you establish a relationship with him? How did you first make contact with him to be able, because you have such specific details about their being on the lam. And obviously that came from multiple conversations. I'm assuming hundreds of hours of time with him. How did you establish this relationship, and how forthcoming was he?
Yeah. So several months, it was March 6th of 2016 where I actually visited David Sweat for the first time. And that was about, let's see, from June to March, 8 or 9 months or whatever, until I first met him, right? Since from the time the escape happened to the actual first meeting. And it was because of what I was saying before. I just couldn't let this go in my head. I was like, nobody's interviewed him. Let me just try. So I went up to 5 Points Correctional Facility. It's near the Seneca Falls region of the state, if you're familiar. And it's in Romulus, New York, which is a lot of farms, cornfields. Again, these prisons are usually in places that are a little bit more remote. So I drove up there, and I went through security, just as a regular visitor would. And it just so happened that David was willing to see me. He didn't know who I was for sure. And I sat down in front of him, and, I said, hi, my name's Chelsia Marcius. I'm a reporter. I worked for the Daily News, and I covered the escape when you were out. And I said, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about it. And I said, but before that, I said, I talked to his mother the previous week, and her name is Pamela Sweat. And Pamela told me, she goes, I think David will talk to you. She goes, why don't you bring some quarters for lunch or something? That way you guys could have lunch. It's like a $2 sandwich. He likes he doesn't like the prison food, so he likes the vending machine food. So maybe you want to, get him a sandwich and a soda or something like that, and he'll be happier, in a better mood. I said, okay, And so I plopped down this bag of quarters on the table between David and I said, I'm hungry at least. It's a 9-hour ride to the prison, and I figured we're going to be sitting here for some time, through the lunch hour, about 6 hours actually. I said, would you like anything to eat? And he said, I'll have a cherry Coke, and he wanted a beef sandwich and some chips. So I get less lunch, and I sit down. We start talking. We end up talking for the whole time about Richard Matt, about a little bit of David's life. And at the end of that first interview, I said, I really I enjoyed the conversation, and I said I'd love to come back in 2 weeks. And he said that would be great. And he goes, I've gotten a lot of letters from media, various reporters inquiring about interviews, but you're the only one who's shown up here. So I would definitely continue talking to you. And it was several conversations later, several prison visits later, that I was like, maybe this is a book. Maybe this is a book. I told him, I said, look, I've never written a book before. I don't know how it's going to go, and I can't make any promises. And David Sweat didn't get anything out of this. He didn't get any, obviously, kind of payment or anything for talking to me. It was just all of because he wanted to. And the conversations continued after that. And then, we got into writing letters, which really was a huge help when he wrote me letters into constructing the rest of the book, because like you talked about, Jeff, all of those details, it's hard to retain all of that information from these conversations. So having these handwritten letters from him was super helpful in that regard.
So we're going to, in about another minute or so, bring up our first guest. We'll continue the conversation about the book as we lead into the next guest. But I just want to remind our viewers, we are talking with Chelsia Marcius about her book, Wild Escape, about that upstate prison escape that took place several years ago. And we today are focusing on corrections and on our uniformed public servants. So we're going to bring up our first guest in just a moment. This is New York State Assembly member Linda Rosenthal. And if you don't know Linda, she represents the 67th Assembly District, and that includes the Upper West Side and parts of Clinton, Hell's Kitchen, and Manhattan. She was elected in 2006 after serving 13 years as Manhattan District Director and Director of Special Projects for U.S. Congressman Jerry Nadler. And Assemblymember Rosenthal has passed more than 70 laws that have helped to improve the lives of all New York State residents. She chairs the Assembly's Committee on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, and so today we invited her on to discuss a hearing that just took place a few days ago regarding the effectiveness of medication-assisted treatment, or what's called MAT, in our state's prison. Welcome back to City Watch, Assemblywoman.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome, and good to have you here today. So can you first tell our listeners a little about the measure that was the focus of this week's Assembly hearing?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm chair of the Assembly Committee on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse, and I introduced legislation right now numbered A8774 that would require incarcerated individuals struggling with substance use disorder to be provided with access to medication-assisted treatment at correctional facilities and county jails statewide. So this is a very hot topic, and I wanted to find out more, frankly, from the state agencies as well as from experts in the field about the state of availability of medication-assisted treatments and how to expand their availability statewide.
Hi, Assemblywoman. It's great to meet you. This is Chelsia. I want to ask. Hi. I want to ask you, what does MAT do exactly, and why has it become the standard of care for those struggling with substance use disorder?
Okay, so medication-assisted treatment is the use of FDA-approved medications in combination with counseling and behavioral therapies to provide a whole patient approach to the treatment of substance use disorder. So there are a few drugs that are approved by the FDA: methadone, which is a daily dose; buprenorphine, which is also a daily dose, and for which medical practitioners need a special license from the DEA to prescribe; and now Trexone, which is also called Vivitrol. It's a long-acting drug given in injection form once a month. But the first two are considered the top-line treatment drugs for opioid use disorder. Naltrexone, less so, but we can get into that later if you wish. And so the drugs block receptors in the brain that enable someone to get high when they use an opioid, and they also help to manage the symptoms of withdrawal. And withdrawal, despite what has been out there, can actually be deadly for people who take opioid drugs.
So one thing I had read that was astounding is that only 6 of the state's 54 correctional facilities offer MAT. Why not more?
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to find out when I convened the hearing. And my jaw almost dropped to the floor. We have 54 statewide correctional facilities under the jurisdiction of the state docs, and only 6 of them have MAT treatments. And it's still befuddling to me why we don't have more. The assistant commissioner who testified said that they needed to pilot these programs before scaling it up to more facilities, but I'm not quite sure what needs to be piloted. We know what medication-assisted treatment does, how it works, that it is the standard of care. And that is, a term of art. The SAMHSA, the federal agency, declared that this was the standard of care, meaning this is the exact approach that should be taken, whether it's for people inside the walls or people outside. And the fact that people who are incarcerated are treated or not treated according to the standard of care is unacceptable to me and to many, many advocates and people. I mean, they had many bureaucratic reasons that they need to make guest dosing arrangements with local treatment programs, which is time-consuming and laborious process to identify an organization that could partner with docs. They don't really need that. They could request a waiver, have a medical staffer with a DEA license start prescribing today. I think it's part of the stigma that addiction is a crime. People who are in prison are criminals, and they should be punished. And they could be punished for what they committed, but they should not be punished for what is a disease. Addiction, opioid addiction, substance use disorder is not a crime. It is a disease that is well established by now. However, I think, people in correction facilities and criminal justice do not uniformly recognize that fact. And they're very, very slow to adopt what is the best approach to handling people with opioid use disorder.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few of the benefits of MAT. Could you elaborate on any of those as well as any drawbacks? And one other question is that of the correctional facilities where MAT is at in New York State, can you talk a little bit about some of the successes that they've had? I believe it was the 6, right, that you said that are currently have implemented MAT and have found that it has been, helpful to those individuals.
Right. Well, first off, I don't see any drawbacks. There are no drawbacks if you actually want to save lives and reduce recidivism. That's why it was so astounding to hear that Doc said you have to pilot it. It sounds to me that more than just regular bureaucracy. It sounds like a stubborn intransigence, a failure to recognize reality and what is going on in the prisons. People who use drugs on the outside come in, they force them to detox and withdraw. Now, withdrawal, the symptoms range from nausea and vomiting and chills and just suffering. And there are also emotional and psychological drawbacks, depression, and detox is not recovery. And many people, some estimate maybe 80% of people in correctional facilities have some kind of substance use disorder. So there are drugs available all throughout, the prison system, and people will often go back and use. And so their time in prison is not productive. They're always scrounging for drugs, which can lead also to hepatitis C, HIV transmission, just a host of bad outcomes.
So
the problem is also... Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to let our listeners know you've been listening to Linda Rosenthal, New York State Assembly member, on WBAI, New York, 99.5 FM, and streaming live at WBAI.org. I'm sorry, Assemblywoman, would you like to continue?
Sure. Medication-assisted treatment can lowers mortality, not just for overdose, but for overall mortality. Also, the health and the correctional staff in the prisons, it's better for them. It allows other health problems to be addressed more reliably. And, instead of a teeming and chaotic setting in the midst of withdrawal or imminent overdose, it reduces the prevalence of those symptoms that I spoke about, also headache. But, if someone has diabetes, or if someone has cancer, or if someone has a disease behind bars that can be treated, there is no question, although in some cases it's cruel and casual application of the actual treatments, but they are allowed to have access to them. Why, for this disorder, would there not be access? And so we can try to crack that nut with the correctional facilities, or we can order them, which my bill would do, to develop a program to have medication-assisted treatment in all prisons. I think officials' acceptance of this standard of care might be harder to implement rather than just ordering them to implement medication-assisted treatment. So they don't have to believe, but they have to implement it according to my bill, which has so much support from advocates, from physicians, from formerly incarcerated people, treatment providers, county mental health providers. There's no objection to it. Vermont.
And you're saying there's no objection. How officially from the from the Senate, from the governor? Are you seeing objections from them? And do you think that that landscape is going to change right now, given that we're about to see total Democratic, domination come January?
Well, we're all relying on this hope that we've had for years that when the Senate flips to Democratic control, many things will improve, and that is true in the case of people incarcerated having access to medication-assisted treatment, as well as a whole suite of treatment to people on the outside who also struggle. New York State is among the highest, among the highest number of people who are overdosing. It's a huge problem in the state. The barrier that I can see is monetary, as is most things, but it's not as expensive as having people die, having to deal with the crime related to illicit drug use, to the human suffering. And so it's really a matter of funding. There is so much money flowing from the federal government now to deal with the opioid use disorder crisis, and I think it's incumbent upon the state, from the governor, his agencies, on down, to access that funding and put it to good use. Evidence-based treatment that will help save lives. So I think the fight will be, how much money do we get to treat people.
Oh, so where is the bill right now?
Okay, so this session, the past 2-year session, our terms end at the end of December, and the new session begins in January. So I will reintroduce this bill, and then it will wend its way through the legislative process. It'll be referred to a committee. It'll go on the agenda. We'll discuss it. We'll vote on it. And hopefully it gets to the floor, and the same process needs to happen in the state Senate. But the governor can also list this among his priorities when he gives his State of the State message, and those usually, help set the tone for what all of us will be working on. So treating the opioid epidemic both behind the walls and outside the walls must be on his top 10 list, because it grips so many people, affects so many families, affects the future of our state. So we need to deal with this immediately in a comprehensive way, and not in a, hit or miss, or let's ignore some rural counties, let's not face the true impact of it, which has characterized some of the ways the state has dealt with this over the years.
And Assemblywoman, you mentioned families and the impact that this will have, not just on the people that need this sort of help, that are currently incarcerated or have been in and out of the system, but the family members as well. Can you just expand upon that a little bit about, because a lot of times we think of these things in terms of statistics and not really as people. And we'd love to hear a little bit about just what this would do for, families who are really struggling to help their loved one try to stay out of this system and really get on the right path in life.
Yeah, it is. I mean, as you know, and people out there know, substance use disorder, the need for heroin, the need for opioids, just rises above a person who has that disorder, above every other need in their life. So they must have access to their drugs, which means that they will steal from their mother. They will go out on the street and risk their lives, use dirty needles. This is the part of the disease that people need to understand. It is a critical need, and it affects families. We heard such sad testimony from a couple of parents at the hearing the other day whose children had, and adult children too, had died of overdose. And one was in prison. He had tried to sneak in some buprenorphine, which is one of the approved treatments to stop the craving and handle the withdrawal systems, put it in his body cavity. He was found with it, so he was punished. And it was taken away. Eventually, he found his way to heroin, and through a series of these kinds of problems, he overdosed and died. He should have had access to buprenorphine in the prison. He should have been treated as a person with a disease. And we had a father testify whose son, who was 26, he was never given medication-assisted treatment. The father was racked with sobs in front of all of us in this hearing room, and it was one of the saddest things I've seen in a long time, when there are treatments to provide, and yet they are not given to the people who need them. And so it affects not just the person with the opioid use disorder, it affects everyone around them. It ruins not just their own lives, but families' lives, communities' lives. It's the people who love them are despondent, are everybody is affected by this. And it's unconscionable when we know this is a proven approach to help people get into recovery, that we don't give it to them.
So, Assemblywoman, we've got about a minute. We've got about a minute left. So, I'd like you to just let us know how people can learn more about 8774 and about the work of your office.
Okay, I'd love to tell you. They can visit my official website, which is at nyassembly.gov, and then you can search for my name. On Facebook, Linda B. Rosenthal. On Twitter, at Linda B. Rosenthal. Instagram, Linda B. Rosenthal _67. Of course, you can always call my office, 212-873-6368. Come to my office, 230 West 72nd Street, between Broadway and West End, Suite 2F. You can, I'm happy to talk to anybody who wishes to engage in discussion about this. You can look up the bill on the Assembly website, but that number will change next year as it gets reintroduced. And you can just Google and look at groups like the Drug Policy Alliance, Vocal New York. There are so many groups that have published information about the crisis and about proven and effective ways to treat it. So, I hope people do that and help me in Albany to advocate for passage of this bill and many others that will help treat people with substance use disorder as humans and humanely.
New York State Assembly Member Linda Rosenthal, thank you so much for joining Chelsia and I here on City Watch today.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
So before we get to our next guest, one question I wanted to just come back to you on, Chelsia, was tomorrow night on Showtime, a fictionalized series starts about the escape from Dannemora. Were you involved in that? Because, my sense is if it's fictionalized, did they draw a lot of details from your book?
No, Ben Stiller's project is separate from mine, but I think we both had the same goal of trying to bring David Sweat, mine through writing, him through on screen, to life for people that don't know him. And that I think that was a mutual goal in of each other, just to try to make that happen for viewers and readers alike.
Well, I will say I found your book fascinating. I enjoyed it very much. I have not read a good true crime book in a while. So,
oh, thank you, Jeff. I so appreciate it.
And we're going to come back to a discussion of the book at the end of the show for a few minutes, but we now have our next guest on the line. Our next guest today is Dalvanie Powell. She is president of the United Probation Officers Association, and this is a union that represents more than 800 members. If you don't know much about probation, this is the process where the court has determined that a person can avoid prison or jail and remain in the community under probation supervision. They provide community-based accountability and support for those who would otherwise be incarcerated, and they provide services such as investigations, victim advocacy, community supervision, and immediate response to violations. Dalvanie, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning.
Good morning to you. So tell us a little about the responsibilities of a typical probation officer.
So before I answer that question, I always want to say this. Probation is like the piece of the puzzle to the criminal justice system that's misunderstood and not given the recognition that we deserve. But we also are the scales of justice in that we are law enforcement and social workers, and we save the city and state a tremendous amount of money. The responsibility of probation officers is to provide services to men, women, and youth who are convicted or adjudicated of a criminal act. We're also responsible for helping those individuals make better choices so they can become law-abiding citizens, and also to protect the community at large. But there's so much more to us that a lot of people don't know. And we have, like you said, the investigation unit, the intake unit. We have a specialized unit called the Intel. We even do child support cases. And we deal with the most high-risk individuals, like you said, that otherwise could have been incarcerated.
And Dalvanie, this is Chelsia Marcius. It's great to meet you. And I want to ask you, how many probation officers are there in the city?
We're close to a little over 800 right now. We're growing now because of Raise the Age, but right now it's about a little over 800.
And in fact, you mentioned Raise the Age. That took effect in October, so you say you're growing. Did this growth start before then, and how has the job of probation officers changed as a result of Raise the Age?
In preparation for Raise the Age, the department started doing a massive hiring in preparation for Raise the Age. Probation officers has always dealt with 16 and 17-year-olds prior to Raise the Age, but because of Raise the Age, as you know, there's been a shift on where those young people will now be serviced. So probation officers in family court will now be dealing with 16 and 17-year-olds, which we have begun. There's different units. We've added new units like the CLO units that will be dealing with the youth courts. And there's two aspects of probation that in family court that's very significant in the diversion of youth out of the system, which is the ICM unit, which is the Intense Community Monitoring Predisposition Unit, where probation officers work with the young youth before they are actually sentenced to probation or to placement. And then we have our adjustment units, which is a really good program that was not in adult. And this program is the sole purpose of diverting them out of the system, never into having to even, in hopes that they never have to even go to court. And services are provided for them. If they're successful, the case goes away. If not, unfortunately, the case has to be referred to court. So those are one of the good points of for Raise the Age and for these youth.
And Dalvanie, you answered this a little bit already, but just for people, for our listeners who don't know, what exactly is Raise the Age?
Raise the Age was created because, from my understanding, make sure I get this right. As far as Raise the Age was created because they felt that somebody 16 and 17-year-old was not responsible for the choices that they make, and they was too young to be a part of the adult system, and it gives them another chance at life. You know, for somebody 16 and 17-year-old to be a part of the adult, they become victims themselves, and kids change. We all make mistakes when we was young. And I'm not who I was when I was 16 and 17-year-old. So I think we all agree that Raise the Age was a good move because we changed. And I can look back at what I did at 16 and 17-year-old, and I'm not making those same choices anymore. So like I said, it gives them another chance at life.
And yeah, Raise the Age took effect on October 1st of this year, and that's when the state no longer would automatically charge all 16-year-olds as adults.
Right.
And then next year, the law phases in for 17
right.
17s. So let's talk about you. Why did you become a probation officer, and how long have you been in the probation system?
Honestly, Jeff, my intentions was never to become a probation officer. I was supposed to go to school. I went to John Jay. I was supposed to become an attorney. But somewhere along the road, there was other plans for me that I didn't know anything about. And when I graduated from John Jay sent out my resume. And whoever called me first, I got the job. So I was blessed, and I became a probation officer. My goal was to stay there for 5 years, but 31 years later, I'm still here standing and loving every bit of my job. So I think that I was supposed to be an advocate in another kind of way. I advocate for the probationers, the people who come through probation, and now I'm here as the probation officer, the president for the probation officers, and I'm meant to advocate for them.
So you obviously chose a career in probation instead of the legal profession as an attorney because you wanted to make more money.
More money, please.
You know where I'm going. So what is?
Woo, that was a funny. I stayed I didn't stay. I love probation so much that the money, and I'm going to say this real carefully because I don't want to get beat up, but I stayed because the spiritual gratification that I got from doing the job. The money, no, it absolutely is not the best money. It's not. It's not good at all.
And that's where I'm going to, like how
I know where you're going.
how the salaries compare for probation officers here in New York City. With what's the starting pay? What's the average pay? And how does it compare with surrounding counties? Even if we don't have specific numbers, I'm just curious where it stands.
I did a whole breakdown for you. So probation officers in New York City to date, they start at $42,759. Now, mind you, we have to have college degrees in order to get this job, at a bachelor's at the least, and now the department is leaning on master's degrees. So we started at $42,759 with no experience, and about $49 and change with experience. For a supervisor, after you get promoted, you start at $54,030, and then you're supposed to go to $85,000, which never happens. I did a quick analysis when I became the probation officer, the president of the probation officers, and it was really sad to see that we never reached our top salary. So I was trying to figure out why that wasn't happening, so I compared us to corrections, NYPD, which are predominantly men, and then I compared us to our brothers and sisters in Westchester County and Nassau County. And when I found that just in Westchester County alone, they're starting at the mid-50s as probation officers, and they just signed a contract recently which will take them up to $90,000 plus after 7 or 8 years. Something is wrong with that picture. And then when I looked at NYPD in New York City, their starting salary started at $42,000, and after 5 or 6 years, they go to $85,000. And then corrections, they go to $86,000 after 5 or 6 years. And let me just say this real quick: with Raise the Age, DJJ, they created another another title for them, which is called Youth Development Specialist. And they're starting at $45,000, and they're getting a guarantee after 7 years, the top salary of $59,000. So we're chasing a carrot that we was never going to reach, and that's unacceptable. And I consider what they put on paper as our top salary as false advertisement.
And Dalvanie, it sounds like some of these grievances, were those part of the lawsuit that you filed against the city
Yes.
to address some of these things?
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about that lawsuit?
That was the basis of the lawsuit. I had spoke to other union heads and found out that some of them had issues, and so I said, you know what? Why not try? Let's see where we can go with it, because this has been a thorn in our hip for a very long time. So I pursued it. I met with our attorney Yetta Kirkland, and she listened to our story. She had some focus groups with a couple of my members, and they got together and gathered information. And quite obviously, we must have a case. So I wanted to see how far we can go with it. There's no guarantees, but the only way to know if we can succeed is to only try, because you fail when you don't. So I need to know how far we can go with it.
Absolutely. And Dalvanie, just again, for those of us who don't know, when did you file the lawsuit, and where are you at in the process of that right now?
The lawsuit, I can't remember exactly the date, but about a month and a half ago.
Yeah, it's in September, right?
Yeah, September. And then the case is going back to court for hearing this Monday, the 19th.
So as much as you're squabbling with the city over this, you also just recently had a victory, something that I had read about. I believe it was in the Daily News that had broken the story about unlimited sick time benefits for members of EMS, but believe that has been expanded and covers your members as well. Can you tell me a little about that?
Yes, that's another victory for probation officers, the United Probation Officers Association, which shows that we're definitely heading in the right direction. And I think I can have the opportunity to now thank the mayor and DC 37 for coming to that agreement and including us in this victory. When 9/11 hit, my members was down there. They was part of the search. They was part of the rescue. They was the rescue process. They worked in every capacity as possible. They kept going back, and they didn't give up. I even found out recently from one of my colleagues that we even participated in helping with interpretations of different languages. So it was well-deserved, and I'm really happy for us for this.
So, Dalvanie, we've got about a minute left. How can people learn more about the work of the United Probation Officers Association?
Well, they can go to unitedprobation.com, or they can call 212-274-9950.
Oh, and before I forget, when does your next class start? Because you said you guys are growing. When's the next class?
Actually, it started already, Jeff. It started in November 13th.
About how many people are part of that?
I think there's about, because I have the orientation this Monday, I believe it's going to be about 28, and then there'll be more coming in, and then we have probation officer trainees coming in, which is another. I'll come back on the show and talk about that later. But there's a constant rollout of probation officers, and the department is looking to hire and looking to promote more supervisors as well, because we're going to need them.
Dalvanie Powell, President of the United Probation Officers Association, thank you for joining Chelsia and me, Jeff Simmons, here on WBAI this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dalvanie.
Have a great day.
Okay, bye-bye.
So in the final 2 or 3 minutes that we have, or a few minutes before we have to close the show, just wanted to get final thoughts on your book, Wild Escape by Diversion Books, and what's next for you.
Yeah, well, the book came out earlier this year, and it really exceeded my expectations in the amount of number of people that have been so kind to say so many nice things about it. And in terms of what's next, I'm not quite sure. I'm no longer at the Daily News, and so I do teach at NYU to a wonderful group of undergraduate students.
Budding journalists.
Yeah, budding journalists. It's really great to see their enthusiasm for the profession, which keeps up my enthusiasm, to be frank. Yeah.
I'm going on a sidetrack. I'm sidetracking here.
Yeah.
When you talk to them, do they bring up, the any friction between the president and the press and their views on, does it make them more impassioned to be journalists? Does it?
Absolutely. I definitely think the Trump administration has ignited a fire in a lot of young people, and that kind of translates to the young people who want to become reporters. And it is a topic of conversation that does come up in class fairly often. But, they are very, they're the ones that really know this is what they want to do. And whether we're talking about, politics or some sort of policy that they feel really impassioned about, they are pretty gung-ho to be part of the media mix and just kind of get in there and make sure that they're reporting and the voices of people that they want to report on are heard, especially now more than ever.
If people want to find out more about the book and about you, where do they go?
Yeah, so they can follow me on Facebook or Twitter. My Twitter handle is Chelsia Marcius, Chelsia Marcius. You can go to the Diversion Books website. I'm represented by Charlene Martin of Martin Literary Management, who has some great information on her website as well. You can get the book at Amazon or Barnes & Noble, and there's audiobooks too, in case you're driving and you want to listen to an audiobook about Dana Moore. It's there for you.
So Chelsia Rose Marcius, thank you very much for joining me here today on City Watch. I also would like to thank our guests, New York State Assembly member Linda Rosenthal and Dalvanie Powell, President of the United Probation Officers Association. Another edition of City Watch is coming to a close. I'd like to also thank our wonderful engineer, Sean, for a great performance on the boards. And thank you again to our listeners for supporting the show. We're simply unable to do any of this without your generosity. Remember, if you missed any part of today's show or just want to listen again, the MP3 download is available at WBAI.org. You can click on Archives and then on City Watch. The show will be up and ready online in about 10 minutes and be up for 90 days. That's it for us, and have a great weekend.